Okay, hi guys. I'm going to talk through a little bit of these stations because we didn't get as much time as we need to in class, of course. I want to make sure that you get a chance to ask me questions if you have them. That's why that's in this Edpuzzle format, so you can type me any questions that you have. So as far as the summary for King's refutations, I went over a lot of these with you guys, so I expect that you can move through this part pretty fast. When we think about how King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference are outsiders, that's the first criticism of the clergyman. King responds to that in several ways. First of all, he says, I'm the president of the organization and we were invited here. Okay, so he goes to that kind of concrete, and then he goes to the more moral and philosophical. I'm here because injustice is here, right? And anywhere that there is injustice, I need to be. The last thing he says is that anyone who lives within the United States can never be considered an outsider. So he begins his letter in this way, right? He has to justify to them first why he is there before he goes and tries to explain more of their cause and the morality behind their cause. So I mark that primarily as paragraphs 2 to 4. As we go through this, you might note that you have more things or different things marked than I do, or that I don't cover everything. All of that is okay. This is an extensive letter, so we might not have overlaps of every single thing. The second criticism that the clergymen make is that the demonstrations are untimely. So when I think about King's arguments here, and I go to pull up his letter, I think about when he is talking about, first of all, he proves to them, well, actually, we have been timely. And so in paragraphs 8 and 9, sorry that it's going to be a lot of flipping here, right? But in paragraphs 8 and 9, if I can find them, he starts talking about, well, look, like last September we started with this, we tried this, it didn't really work, and then we started waiting around for this and that kind of thing, like, okay, well, maybe we should wait for Easter, and then maybe we'll wait, but then there's Christmas, and now the mayor's coming up. So we want you to know that we really have thought about the timeliness of this, is the first part. And that's kind of the nice part, in my opinion. And then he goes on to say, history shows, essentially, he's saying, history shows that powerful people will not change the status quo unless they are forced. So he goes into more of that argument. And then, of course, we look at that pathos that comes next. And that means we're going to head over to paragraph 13. And this is where he starts talking about, well, wait a second. In reality, we have waited 340 years for this to come about. And one of my absolute favorite lines of this entire letter is this final one in this paragraph. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience, right? And so he's deferring to them. He's calling them sirs very politely, but he's using that word impatience. So it's kind of paradoxical, right? I'm going to tell you, well, actually, we've waited for 340 years. And so, yeah, we're a little impatient about it at this point in time. I love that. When we go to talking about breaking the law leads to hatred and violence, this is where he starts talking about how there are two types of laws, that there's an unjust law and a just law. And so the the breaking of an unjust law isn't really the breaking of a law at all. So in particular, again, he references this idea of if Black voters have been prevented from voting, they don't really have a say in laws and election, and therefore the laws are null and void if they promote injustice against the Black population. Another thing that he talks about, if we go to paragraph 19 now, sometimes the law is just on its face and unjust in its application. So what he's talking about here is where he was arrested for not having a parade permit. And really what his argument here, again, about the law is that if a law is being used to deny a person their First Amendment rights, then it's not really that a law anyway. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. The last thing that we're talking about is how the violations of civil rights should be negotiated in the courts and not with demonstrations. And that's kind of tied into this last one. And so here's where I put also that if the judges and the lawmakers are democratically elected, but actually the majority of, or a lot of the citizens did not participate in the vote, then that they weren't fairly elected to begin with, and they can't trust that they would actually vote and represent them in their best interests. So I think you guys have this, and of course there's more here, but I think that's good for the first station. Let me know if you have questions on that. We're going to skip through this organization a little bit pretty quickly, but I do want to bring up that when we look at his organization, we can really call this concession and rebuttal. Okay, actually concession and refutation would be a better way to call this. And the reason we know this is basically what he is doing is he is politely deferring to them first. Well, so one of the things you say is this. Like, for example, that it's untimely. And yes, we understand that it's untimely, but here's my answer to that. And then he goes against it. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break the law. This is certainly a legitimate concern. I'm conceding that to you. Breaking the law is a legitimate concern. But now, what's the difference between the two types of laws? Now I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. Okay, that kind of thing. So that's what we're looking at as far as organization. There's some places in here where he changes it up. For example, he goes chronologically here when he's talking about what they did in their untimeliness. Like we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, and then we waited this. And so he uses some structures like that, but we're primarily looking at an organization of concession and refutation. For Station 3, for his ethical appeals, the thing that I really wanted to talk with you about is this idea of intended audience. And we talked a little bit about this today. When we think about his intended audience is obviously the clergymen, but it's also those white moderates that we talked about. He wants to access them because those are the people that he needs to spur into movement, right? That is the coalition of people that he can get to work for him. So when we think about him establishing decorum, first of all, with his clergymen, you guys kind of hit the nail on the head here. We know that in the third paragraph, he starts talking about his education and his expertise, and that continues throughout the piece. So for example, he's bringing up people in the past who have been treated unjustly in the Bible, because he knows that using those biblical figures and information from there will establish him, will put him on the same educational and moral level as the clergyman, right? I know all about this too because I also am a clergyman. When you look at his opening, dear fellow clergymen, right? He is establishing himself as one of them. He does make kind of an interesting switch in this. The whole time when we think about how he's appealing to the clergymen, he is referencing Jesus, and he's referencing some people in there that they would know, different saints and things like that. But near the end, when he starts talking about, he's denouncing the white moderates and the paternalistic view of African Americans as if white people are fatherly over them, he becomes kind of like a dad in this situation where he's so disappointed in you, right? I'm not angry with you, but I am really disappointed with the church and the white leadership here. And so he's almost setting himself apart on a higher moralistic ground, which is kind of interesting. As we move to Station 4 and we talk about logic, we need to think, what's kind of difficult is we normally think about logic as being facts, data, right, that kind of thing, statistics. King doesn't have a whole lot of that. His his movement here, his argument is philosophical and moral argument. So he uses some facts, right? We have these ideas that he brings in about other nations. He references Hitler and Germany. He talks, again, you could almost consider his knowledge about the Bible as logical statistics. He talks about the 340 years that they've waited, that kind of thing. But we need to think more in this case with logos being about his logic, his sense of reasoning. So I think that for him, he structures this really as his use of rhetorical questions. So when we think about that, he sets up a question for them. He's like a teacher. First, I'm going to say, well, you ask me this, and then now I'm going to tell you my reasoning and my logic behind that. So what makes the law unjust, you ask? Well, I'm going to tell you, and here comes my information about what makes a law unjust. So again, with the second question, the answer is he doesn't have a whole lot of statistics because this is an argument that is based in philosophy and morality. Okay, when we think about pathos, and this is our last station, thanks for bearing with me, and we think about what emotional appeals does King most often employ. My guess is that you all immediately jump to paragraph 13. In paragraph 13, King does that wonderful passage where he talks about waiting for 340 years, but then he talks about these things that African Americans have gone through that white people just don't have experience in. When you've seen mobs lynch your mothers and fathers, right? That appeals to them because everyone has a mother and father or a brother or sister. And so people get an emotional sense from that. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? That kind of thing, that repetition of those events that African Americans face, that's a pathos. I would like to argue, though, also that, that he uses allusions as a way to be emotional, to reach the clergyman emotionally. Allusions are references to famous things in history, religion, that kind of stuff. So he uses this to appeal to their sense of ethics here, because, like, I'm one of you. I know all these things. I can talk about Jesus and St. Equinox and all this stuff. And he even throws in names that only theologians would know, like Martin Buber and Paul Tillich. Like, we don't know them. We hear Jesus and we're like, okay, he's referencing the Bible. But these guys, the analogies that he's using, the people that he's using, he's going to be respected by knowing that kind of thing. And I think then that makes them feel more guilty in turn. Another thing that we look at is the use of parallelism. Parallelism is the repetition of sentence structure. And so when we think about repeating something, right, repetition, that could be the repetition of the same word over and over again or the same idea. But parallelism is when the sentence structure is repeated. I mean, look at parallelism. I'm looking at this paragraph where he addresses the white moderates and he is repeating the same sentence structure here when he says something like, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, who constantly says, who paternalistically believes, who lives by a mythical concept. That type of repetition, that's called parallelism, right? So that adds a rhythm, but that also adds a lot of effect emotionally. The last thing I would say that he utilizes is a lot of imagery and metaphor. So I pulled this out of paragraph 13 I went back to just as an example of a metaphor that I marked. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say. So there are times when he paints a picture, like this whole paragraph about being able to use the imagery to picture that in your mind. But then there's also these times where he provides these really powerful metaphors, and they add to the pathos as well. That's it. Next time we'll talk about tone. Please let me know if you have any questions at all. Bye!